All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, folks, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Dr. Charlie Hall, holder of the Ellison Chair in International Floriculture here at Texas A&M, and I'm just delighted that you've joined us this morning. We've got a great topic and a great speaker, whom I'll introduce in just a second. I do want to call out our sponsors. We've got the Southern Risk Management Education Center that, through grant funding, provides a few funds in order for us to have the webinar software to be able to bring today's meeting to you, as well as the Texas Nursery and Landscape Association. So thanks very much to our sponsors. I will say that there's been a few changes in the GoToWebinar software system, and I think most of all that has been worked out over the last 3 months. But if you have any difficulties in terms of audio, I'll show you what to do here in a second. But your screen should look very similar to what I have here on this particular slide. And as you go through today's webinar, if you do have any sort of difficulties and you want to get that control panel out of the way, you can click on that orange arrow and click on it again, and the control panel opens up. And you can make the window larger and actually click on View and click on full screen. It makes it a little bit bigger. Sometimes when we have a spreadsheet on the slide, it makes it a little easier to see the numbers. And if you have any audio difficulties, of course, everyone is muted right away when they join the webinar. But if you're having some audio issues, you can click up there to use telephone, and it'll pop up there with the number that you need to dial, as well as a pin. And you just click that in there, and you're off and running. We're going to hold all questions to the end, and actually, I may depart from that, Marco. I may ask a few questions while we're going, but particularly at the end, if we haven't addressed those questions during the webinar, we'll address those at the end. You can type in your question in the question box that's in your control panel, and that works out very well. Let me say at this point, there's going to be a very short evaluation survey at the end. It's very important for us to garner your opinions, and it'll take you about 38 seconds to fill out this evaluation. It's helpful to us, and it's very little intrusiveness on your time, so I appreciate you filling that out. And if you happen to get called away, don't worry about it, because tomorrow, in roughly 24 hours from now, you'll receive an email from the system with a link to the recorded version of today's session. So we are in the midst of recording this, and if you know of others who wanted to be here but couldn't, you can feel free to share that particular link. All right, so let me move on. I said we've got a great speaker, and today's speaker is a great friend of mine and a very talented economist, and I'm delighted that he's here to share some of the results of our National Green Industry Survey that we've been working on for a year and a half now. Dr. Marco Palma. Marco is an associate professor and extension economist at Texas A&M University. I got his LinkedIn page there on the left-hand side of the slide, and Marco is very talented. He's a horticultural marketing economist, and he crosses the entire horticultural sector. So he covers ornamentals and fruits and veggies, and has an applied research program that has received a lot of notoriety. So I'm pleased that Marco's here with us today. So with that, Marco, I'm going to change the presenter on here in the control panel turn things over to you, and then you can kick us off, and I'll introduce any questions along the way that we have, and we'll go from there.
Well, thank you very much for that very nice introduction, my friend. I appreciate the opportunity to share with you some of the results of a very long-standing committee that has had a lot of impact in the green industry, and many of you participating today may have seen some of the previous surveys. Well, this is the continuation of a lot of effort by different people, and in fact, this committee these committees are set up in such a way that they're operating in a 5-year to 5-year basis. And I've been fortunate to be the chair of the committee for the last 4 years or so, and we just received approval for the project to continue as the S1065, and so that number keeps changing. And the committee is really the Green Industry Research Consortium, and is essentially composed by agricultural economists and horticulturalists doing work in the green industry. And so you will probably will continue to see some of the work that the committee develops. In particular to the National Green Industry Survey, I would like to thank my friends and co-authors, Alan Hodges at the University of Florida, who has put together the database and done a lot of the number crunching that we're going to be seeing today. And of course, Charlie Hall, who is overviewing the overall project, and it's an expert not only in terms of the economics, but also with a tremendous amount of knowledge in the industry. Also, hi, Katja Ryan, who's at the University of Florida, and he's doing a lot of work related to the industry. So I would like to thank them and the sponsors of the money used to collect the data, the Horticultural Research Institute and Texas A&M University and University of Florida. So what I'm going to be doing with you today is I'm going to be sharing some of the overall results and some of the overall trends for the green industry for the 2014 National Green Industry Survey. And then I'm going to be showing you some of the economic impact numbers. Hopefully, Charlie, if you want to at any point ask a question or make a comment, you're more than welcome to do so, since you're one of the co-authors and are very familiar with this work. So why is it important for us to look at these numbers? And you know, I think that whenever we look at presentations related to the economic impact numbers, I think it's sometimes easier for us to look at a report and look at the numbers at our own pace, because it sometimes may be a little bit overwhelming in terms of the amount of information that is being delivered to you at once. And so, but I think it's very important for many reasons. The number one is because we can look at the state of the industry in terms of the size and growth. This particular survey is very important because we will provide you with a comparison to our previous survey, which was conducted in 2008 and collected data through fiscal year 2007. So in a comparative static dynamics, we can look at the state of the industry before the Great Recession and after the Great Recession. In fact, when we finish doing some of the numbers, I may ask Charlie to comment about some of the changes that have been taking place prior to the Great Recession and after the Great Recession. But these general numbers should give you an idea of the numbers and how they've been changing over time. Of course, it gives us some visibility and impact with consumers and especially with policymakers. And when we look at the economy and how we have been growing, generating jobs, we look at industries, and our industry is very good in creating a lot of jobs out there. And so this is something that we can all relate to. But most importantly, if you're a producer, if you're somebody that is involved in the industry, you can look at the current practices about what people are doing in general, and what are some of the things in terms of marketing, in terms of the decision-making process, business decision and business practices. And if there is something that you see out there that you're not currently doing, perhaps you might be thinking about implementing those type of strategies in your own business. And finally, the more informed that you are, the better decisions you can make. And so the more information you can collect, it's usually better. I've always said that we have lived in the world throughout different stages. The stage where when an oil-based economy, we had the railroad systems expansion. We have many different eras, and I think that today we're living in the era of information. And we are living at a unique point in time where big data is an issue in terms of the amount of information that is collected out there, and how people use that information can shape the future of their personal lives and also of their businesses. And so from that perspective, it's very important for us to look at these numbers and the data. But also from a perspective in the sense that we used to get annual data related to sales and marketing and production trends for the industry. But unfortunately, in 2006, because of funding constraints, those data are no longer reported on an annual basis. We do have some limited reports, but even then, before the reports were no longer put out, we had gone from about 36 states to 15 states surveyed in 2005. On the nursery side, we only included about 17 states, and those numbers were extrapolated. We do have some data that are very useful and very important for you, so if you can get your hands on them, I will also encourage you to take a look at those. As the horticultural specialist survey of horticultural specialties is an example, but that only comes out every 5 years. So with the limited status of the USDA reports, I think that this is why it's important for us to keep doing this survey, because we have been doing it for a long time, and so that provides you with a continuous time series data of the overall trends for the industry. So these results I'm going to be presenting today are the 6th national nursery survey since 1987 by the committee that I was mentioning to you. We compile a list of about 110,000 grower and plant dealers from all 50 states in the country, and then we stratified that to a random sample of 15,000 firms that we conducted via regular mail and 17,000 firms that we conduct via the internet through an email survey. The questionnaire was very similar to past surveys. As much as we want to change some of the questions, there's always a trade-off in terms of making sure that we have a database over time that we can relate to, and so changing a question slightly might change it in such a way that we're not collecting the same data. So in that regard, that's why we try to keep the survey as similar as possible to previous versions. We did add new questions this year related to plant dealers and retailers, and the information you're about to see is for data collected in operations for fiscal year 2013. The survey was launched in the summer, July 2014, and there were 2 mailings of the questionnaire and then follow-up reminders. We screened the data to make sure that we didn't have any duplicates or any outlier values that might not be correct entries, and we ended up with 2,657 valid responses, which represent about an 8% response rate. Here is the summary of respondents, and before you look at those numbers, I want to clarify that these numbers are the sales reported by those people who filled out the survey. So it's not the expanded sales to look at the number of firms or any of that, which I'm going to be presenting in a few minutes, but this will give you a flavor of where the responses are coming from. And as you can see in the map, we have representatives from virtually every region in the country, and all those 2,657 respondents represent about close to about $4 billion in sales. Now what we're going to do with this is we're going to look at the number of firms that are operating in each particular state and then expanding those sales to make an estimate of the total sales on a state-by-state basis and of course at the national level. So I want to make a few points as I go through the presentation, and I think that the point number one I want to make is that the number of years that firms have been operating in the industry. And as you can see in this graph, we have firms that have been operating for a very long time, even going as far back as the 1800s. However, that's a very small percentage of the firms. And as you see, when we progress through time, we have 4.6% of the firms established between 1900 and 1950. And as we progress through to an earlier dates, you can see that in the 1970s, there's about 11% of the firms, almost 12% of the firms that were established in the 70s, and 17% in the 80s, and 19% in the 90s, 24% in the 2000s. I think that what's important for us to see is that in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, the industry was going in a period of such economic expansion that generated a lot of interest. Entrepreneurs look at the industry and they show a lot of profits in those years. And this is reflected here by the number of firms that were established and they continue to operate today during those years. Of course, as we can see now between 2010 and 2014, part of that drop is because we only have about 4 years of data, but also maybe there's some impact of the Great Recession. And so while you have a distribution of firms going everywhere, you can see here that the economics of profits serve as a way of increasing attention and increasing the entry of new firms. In economics, we typically say that profits are zero in the long run. What we mean by that is that if there are positive profits in the industry that attracts entrepreneurs to operate, and when you increase the number of firms in the industry, that puts some pressure in the overall cost of production because people have to be more efficient in the use of their resources. And at the end of the day, that ends up being in a lot of firms exiting the industry because too much competition. And so that's probably what we started to see, and my good friend Charlie has been arguing that we are operating now in what is a mature market. So I think that this slide provides you with a very good picture representation of the state of the industry through time by looking at the number of firms that have been operating. Then the second point I want to make is, yes, we have seen a lot of growth, especially in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. It's interesting to see that change after the Great Recession, but let's also look at the firm size distribution. How big are those firms? And what I have here in this slide is on the left-hand side, I have the number of firms by different sales categories. So when you look at this first category, those are firms that sell less than $250,000, and we have a little bit over 2/3, 67 or almost 68% of the firms that are reported sales of less than $250,000. However, if you combine all those firms together, they only represent about 3% of the sales. And so as you go through the categories here, you can see there's 60% of the firms that produce between $250,000 and $1 million. And together, they represent about 5% of sales. And then there's about 10% of the firms that sell between $1 and $4 million, and they represent about 12%. Now, if you go all the way down to the largest sales category, you see that there's only 0.4% of the firms who sell $50 million or more. However, that very small percentage of firms accounts for 18% of total sales. So point number one is that we've had a lot of firms entering the industry, which probably has resulted in a lot of more competition and forcing a lot of the firms to become more efficient in the use of resources, and that many of those firms are small. So why is that important? That's important because the sales proposition and the strategy for marketing that you're going to use depends very highly in where you are in the spectrum of the sales categories. So if you are a grower in the categories going from less than 250,000, maybe up to about $1 million, in those small categories, small, medium size, then you are probably looking at trying to put a strategy where you will try to differentiate your products or make it different, because certainly you cannot compete with some of the large growers because of economies of scale. It would be very difficult for you to compete in trying to be the lowest cost operator. Now, there's also the possibility that you might have a vertical integration where you have a retail operation in addition to the grower operation, and those are certainly things that you may evaluate. But depending on where you are in this spectrum, then your marketing strategy may differ based on the sales. So that's the importance of this slide, and we can also start to put together a story about what's been happening in the industry. This is the employment, and as you can see here, the breakdown is about 42% of temporary or seasonal employees and 54% for permanent employees. I want to bring to your attention here the first one. I know there's a lot of debate going on in terms of immigration lately, and I want to share with you a couple of studies that were conducted a couple of years ago now. One of them essentially estimated that between half and 66% of the agricultural labor force was undocumented. That was a report that was put together by the Economic Research Service. And that same report estimated that of almost 98% of every newly hired worker in agriculture, and the keyword being new hired worker, was undocumented. Now, that same year, the Department of Labor estimated that about 2% of the labor force in agriculture is obtained through some sort of a temporary workers program like the H-2A. We can see that here, that for our industry is a little bit above the agricultural average of 2% to about 3.1%. But the story we're looking at here is that if we believe those two reports, virtually every single new person that we hire in agriculture is pretty much undocumented. So that will have a lot of impact for us in the future. These are the sales by different plant types, and as we can see here, these are the percentage of sales reported. We can look at the largest categories being bedding plants and flowering annuals, herbaceous perennials. We also see the cedar shade and flowering trees, the cedar shrubs, and you can probably take a closer look at the other sales category. By the way, we're gonna be giving you a link where you can go and look at the full report at your own pace, so you can get these numbers. And so, if you want to take a closer look to the numbers at your own and on your own time, we'll provide with the link of the full report. In terms of the product form, containers are the predominant form with over 73% of sales reported. We also have balled and burlap, about 8%. Bare root constitutes about 7%. And then the other categories, such as in-ground or potting pod, are very small compared to the predominant product forms. Wholesale sales represent about 54% of the total, and then retail is about 40%. And then the marketing channels used are mainly landscaping firms, which is close to about 28%. Wholesalers represent about 20%. Home centers, about 19.9%. Single location garden centers, 16.7%. And then mass merchandisers represent a little bit over 10%, with multiple location garden centers representing about 4.6%. So if you put together the single and multiple location garden centers together, they have about 21%, a little bit over 21% of total sales reported. The sales method, predominantly in person, 47%. Telephone orders account for 21.2%. And I think that over the years, we have seen a reduction in the number of trade show sales transactions, and not only that, but also participation by firms and also by the number of people per firm that typically attend trade shows. So that might be in part as to why we see a reduction, just less networking and less people attending, which probably results in less sales. However, we do see a little bit of an increase in internet sales to about 3.3%. Most of the sales practices are negotiated as to the price and terms. About 26% of those transactions are negotiated as such, followed by production contracted in advance with about 17%, and then broker for other growers represents about 8% of the sales. The advertising media expenditures remain virtually unchanged as a percentage of total sales from a previous survey and remain at about 4%. Where do people spend that 4%? And we have categorized here. One of the things that we talked about that we have adapted from the previous survey we didn't have is that we added this social media category, and we encompass here all different type of social media channels that people use. And we can see here that the largest expenditures are internet, 18%, followed by trade journals, 14%. And then we have other categories that are very similar: social media with 11%, radio and TV Yellow pages still about 7.5%, and trade shows represent about 6%. Then we have other categories, typically newsletters, 4%, catalogs, whether they're printed or CDs, or gardening publications, 2.7%, billboards, 2%. So overall, I think that there's a couple of things that we have done over the years looking at advertising and promotion media. What we see is an overall trend compared to the previous survey where people have switched from different forms of advertising to use more online presence, social media, internet presence, although the percentage of total sales has remained unchanged. So what we have seen changing is where people put the money in terms of these categories. As to the advertising media, we have a study where we group this type of media advertising and their potential impact in generating additional sales, and we group those into terms of internet, mass merchandising, and then everything else. And what we find, of course, is that depending on the size of the firm, some of these media are more efficient in creating additional sales than others. I will encourage you to look at that. We'll probably be updating that study based on these year's report as we move forward in the analysis, in the continued analysis of the report. Irrigation water sources on a national level, 55% comes from wells, 27% from city sources. Natural surface is about 23%, followed by recaptured and reclaimed water. And the application methods, predominantly overhead irrigation, followed by drip irrigation with about 36%, sub-irrigation with 4.8%, and then other methods account for almost 20%. These are the integrated pest management practices that people are using. You can look at the list, but the predominant things that people are doing are removing infested plants, use cultivation or hand weeding, stop treatment of pesticides overall, or at least a reduction of those, inspect incoming stock, elevator space plans for air circulation, and then alternate pesticides to avoid chemical resistance. In terms of the regional trade flows, what this graph shows here is the sales in millions of dollars going from each region to other regions. And so as you can see here, for example, the blue bar represents the amount of sales from the Appalachian region that goes to the Appalachian regions. So this little summary is a good way of putting it. This is the percentage of sales that go outside of that region. So for the Appalachian region, for example, 35% of sales go outside of the region. For the Great Plains is 19%. In the Midwest, almost all the sales remain within that same region, with only 2% of the sales going outside of that region. Mountain is about 25% that is sold outside of the region. For the Northeast and the Pacific is close to about 9%, and then the South Central and the Southeast are at 12 and 19% respectively. When looking at this, we can see that the predominant factors that are very important in establishing prices is, number one, the cost of production. And I think that as an economist, I'm glad to see that the people see that the cost of production should drive or influence very much the decision as to how to determine prices. Of course, there are many other things that people consider to be important, such as the grade or quality of the plants, how unique is the product so that you can effectively differentiate your particular product and have a higher price. Market demand, of course, plays a big role, and many other factors as well. Perhaps some of the things that you don't see very well represented are overall macro trends such as inflation and other macroeconomic factors, which are external, which means essentially that they do affect the production, but there's very little or nothing that growers can really do to influence or change those factors, but they have to accommodate them in their decision-making process. The geographic range, or how far the plants go outside of the region, is mainly driven by transportation issues, and that relates to the cost of transportation. It relates to the infrastructure. It relates to available um, um, transportation offerings, different plant types, for example, the production method, and personnel. And the overall factors impacting the business, we can see that the most important thing that is concerning the top 2 or 3 um, factors are weather uncertainty, market demand, and of course the ability to hire and retain competent people, competent workers, and competent management, and the managerial expertise of the person handling the firm. So with this, what I want to show you next is we took all of these numbers, as I mentioned before. They represent the reported sales, and from that we created expanded sales. And so what we have here is the economic impacts by the industry or by sector. And so as you can see here, the landscaping and horticultural services sector creates about 914,000 jobs. Overall, in total, if you look all across the different sectors, the industry generates about 1 million, 1.6, almost 1.7 million jobs, with a total employment impact or employment economic impact of well over 2.1 million jobs. Now, when we talk about the economic output related to the economic impact related to output, that's essentially sales. So this third column here is the total estimated sales by each sector of the industry. And overall, we see that sales in this last survey for 2014 are $145 billion. If we compare those to the previous survey, I think we were at around 117 billion in sales. So even though we went through a great recession and a period where there was a lot of stagnation and a lot of firms exiting the industry, it has been a sufficiently long enough period of time that we have experienced some recovery in the sales, especially in the last couple of years. We have seen a lot of new infrastructure development, in the sense that we see a lot of new architecture planning and construction, which means that there is a lot of activity related in the industry, and those new housing starts need landscaping. We see people going and doing remodeling activity and spending money in plants again, especially over the last couple of years. So there has been some recovery, at least in the industry, in terms of sales, even though, as I emphasize, there were initially, especially following 2008 and 2009, a lot of reduction in output. So those sales of the sum of output, it's about 145 billion. Then we adjust those also to account with exports, and then the sum of the economic impacts generated only for those sales is at about $209 billion. So that's the total output impacts. And then if we look at things related to the value added, which essentially means we use some of the inputs, we use plastic pots, we use fertilizers, we use many different inputs that are attributed to other industries. And so if you think about this, the value added impacts, those are things that we created or added value to the level of taking all of those inputs to when we sold it. So that's just accounting for the things that were created within the industry only, and not just the overall sales. So if you think about it, you bought some pots, you bought some initial seeds, you use different resources, and then you sold the whole plant. So the output impacts account for the whole amount of sales if it was $20, for example, whereas the value added represents just the value that the industry created for the period of time that those products were being produced. And so the value added impacts are also huge. It's about $129 billion. in sale,
Hey,
in economic impact.
hey,
Yes.
Marco, before you leave that slide, go back one slide there. I had a question that came in. I've been answering questions all through the webinar, but this one I think would be good for everyone to hear, and that all of the nursery, all of the green industry survey results you were talking about earlier were grower-only results. And here we have expanded numbers for not just growers. So growers are in the second line there, the greenhouse, nursery, and floriculture production. But then all the other sectors in the green industry are included in this particular number. So we've got not only growers but landscapers and so forth. But much of the data you're presenting earlier were grower only results. So I just wanted to clarify that. And we use the grower numbers that you're highlighting right there. We use grower numbers from the survey to arrive at these numbers for the economic impacts. But some of the other data on landscape services and so forth came from the economic census. So I just wanted to make that clarification.
That's a really good clarification, and that's a really good comment. Thank you, Charlie.
Yep.
And so, how does it look like for different states? And I'm going to leave this here for a minute. We have broken down all economic impacts by state, and as you can see, California continues to be the #1 green industry state. And again, these represent sales of all the different sectors. So what we'll be talking about the grower side, this is overall output sales for all different sectors within the industry. And so overall sales for California were about $17 billion, and it was followed by Florida with about 10 billion and Texas with 10 billion. One thing that I want to clarify too at this point is that what we have a grower sale output and some of the landscaping output is the actual sales. When we look at the retail level, we have to account for the margins only. And so what that means is that we have a plant that was produced and it was sold to a retailer from a grower at $10, and then the retailer sold it for $20. When we look at the actual output margins for the retailer, if we account for all the $20, we essentially will be double counting that amount because we already counted the $10 when it was sold from the grower to the retailer. And so what we do is we take the margin or the net effect sales for that retailer. And in this example I just provided you, it would be just a $10 sale that is attributed to the retailer only. So what you see here is the sum of output. It's not the overall sales, but that's just the grower sales, retailer sales, and then the margin that corresponds to the retailer. So the actual sales would be a lot higher because essentially retailers sell the product, and part of that is also including the grower sales. So you see the top 5 states are California, Florida, Texas, Pennsylvania, New York, and then you can look at the list here of output, and of course then you have the actual economic impact numbers from that output. So for example, in California there was $17 billion in output accounting for margin, and then overall they represented about 27 billion in economic impacts derived from that output and created about 251,000 jobs. So I'm going to leave this slide here so you can look at it, and I'm going to open it up for some other questions. And by the way, you can get this information from our website. There's a complete report for the first part of the presentation where you have all of the marketing and production trends, and we're currently working on the economic impact report, which will be releasing hopefully very soon. So that's the website that you can go to. You can also go to greenindustryresearch.org, and it will take you to that site.
Okay, Marco, we had another comment from one of our participants that one of their ongoing concerns um, is that politicians and lobbyists and administrators and so forth, they look at these data and projections that are based on the survey or even economic census results, and they may not understand that there may be some underreporting that's going on in this process. And any comment to that?
Uh, you mean in terms of the North American Industry Classification Codes reporting from the growers?
Yes,
Okay,
and also in other categories.
sure. So one of the issues, of course, is that a lot of the data that we use, in this case for the surveys, of course, the methodology itself does not imply that everybody will tell you exactly what the amount may be because of the fear that maybe we're associated with a branch of the government that will be making sure that people are paying proper taxes and so on and so forth. And so, from that regard, we see two things. Number one is that some people might not fully um, reply to the survey or fill out the survey, or they might be underrepresenting some of the numbers, both in the survey and also in the data collected in terms of the actual sales. In fact, I think that we had a couple of people who very insistently emailed us asking us with which branch of the government we were involved with in terms of the taxation purposes and how come we were looking into this type of personal information. And we proceeded to explain that we were researchers at universities. But even after that, I don't think that a few people didn't actually get the message that we were researchers trying to help the industry in making sure that we put these numbers together. Uh, Given the amount of time that we have done this and the number of presentations that we do as a group among all 40 participants, we have had some visibility in the industry, but even then, uh, we had some difficulty in putting that message across. And there were some people that at the end of the day would just say, well, but thank you very much. You have the freedom of not responding. But there was that mistrust that we were somehow spying some of the growers into trying to tell us how much they're producing to make sure that that matches what they're reporting. And so that probably creates a little bit of friction, and that distrust may be translated in people not trying to put the numbers or maybe put in slightly less. And that is an issue. I think that overall in the aggregate it might not matter that much, especially if for the respondents, but that creates some non-respondents issues in people
Yeah.
not actually answering the survey, and lowers the response rate.
But as you said, we've been doing this long enough that folks have a greater degree of confidence in how the numbers are going to be utilized because we do a lot of harvesting from this data and we do a lot of publications in the trade press. And I think more folks know about our efforts than what there were when we first started this back in the early 2000s, generating the economic impacts, that is, from our survey, which has been going on for 30 years. So another possible way of some of the numbers, since they're using the North American Industrial Classification Code, there are always firms that should be in one code that are accidentally put in another. But I know for a fact that each state has been cleaning up those lists over time, and they are more and more accurate each year. And so, even from the Texas comptroller reports that you and I
Hmm.
pull for the Texas numbers, we've seen a vast improvement in how firms are classified, and the vast majority of those are in the correct category. So, over time, we've seen some of this misclassification error reduced. So we have a greater and greater degree of confidence in these numbers as we go along. Now, another question was related to how to use this information. One particular one particular person on the webinar today was a landscape company, and they were wondering what would be the most beneficial use from the report. You want to comment on that? I got my own ideas, but go ahead and comment.
Sure. So number one is that you can look and project different type of forecasting. I mean, this is not a one-stop solution, but you can look at these data to look at the overall trends of what to expect. You can pair this with other resources as well. I mentioned big data at the beginning, for example, and that is being used in many different ways. Perhaps the top three things that I can think of right at the top of my head would be for doing search query analytics, in the sense that if you think about it, how long does it take for the CDC to look at that the flu epidemic is spreading? There has to be an analysis of hospital visits and where geographically those are being held. Anyway, the point is that if you use things like big data, like Google Analytics, for example, you can look at what's the first thing people do when they get sick? They Google remedies over the counter, and so you have an immediate feedback of the number of people searching. So you can look at this report and look at different plant types, and you can use those to plug in into different resources and see what's happening for people looking into different plants. If you see that there's an overall increase in the number of searchers, that might mean that there is an increase in the interest. You can piece this together with previous reports and looking at, well, people are not really buying in trade shows. There are slightly sales going on there, so that might be a detriment to you, or it might be an incentive as to, well, maybe those people who are there need more landscaping firms to attend, so they can provide more. There will be more opportunities for buying, because maybe that's just not happening. So I think that you can read between the lines in terms of looking at, number one, overall trends, but then trying to look at opportunities, and also look at different new plant types, plant varieties, type of sales, and also look at what other people are doing and ask yourself, am I doing this effectively? Is this something that I need to be doing, or something that I need to be changing in my sales proposition or in my business practices?
Yeah, that's a good comment. And of course, another use is obviously both at the local and the state and the national level, with issues like H2B on the landscape side. The debacle that, well, did I really say that out loud? I guess I did. The construing of the H2B program that's being tried right now. We can fight a lot of negative legislation on labor and water and other issues that are going to be impacting the landscape industry by being proactive at the local, state, and national levels, and using this information to show the impacts in terms of jobs and in terms of economic impact, which those are the two main factors that will turn legislator heads. So we have a unique opportunity, I think, to use this information to influence policy, and that's not just a responsibility of our association staff that are representing us in those particular settings, but it's up to each one of us individually to educate even at the local level, because again, those issues are pertinent, particularly water, and combating some of the negative legislation on outdoor watering of landscapes. Okay, another couple of questions are related in terms of what these data versus past studies and the industry trends and so forth. And I'll just say, Marco, at the outset, that the report regarding the survey, that once you back up one slide there so folks can see that URL again. Yeah, so this is where you would go to see the report, and you can see all the previous surveys that have been done. We do those every 5 years. Now, the economic impact analysis, let me just reiterate that it's going to be released a little bit later in the summer, so you can't really compare our 2000 our last survey, 2008 numbers, to this one, because we're going they're not available yet. So really, because you're on this webinar, you got a sneak peek to these numbers that nobody else in the world is seeing. So that's one of the advantages of being online today. So once those are released, then you can compare those numbers. But in general, Marco, compared to our last economic impact survey to this one, anything pop out at you?
Sure. We have seen overall a I think a recovery period. I mean, if you have done some work related to the number of firms operating in the industry, following the previous survey that we did related to the economic recession, and I think that what we experienced was that there was a lot of firms that struggled and eventually exited the industry, especially at the low scale of the categories of sales. So smaller firms were struggling to operate, but there was also a small sector that was still either going flat or even increasing. About 10, 15% of the firms that even within the recession, they were still capturing sales and they were increasing their amount of sales. And I think that if we want to look at the difference between the two, we have seen a recovery period, but perhaps, and this is a topic for another webinar, but perhaps is what makes those firms different, that even within that early period following the recession, they kept growing. They kept selling their plans. They kept changing the value proposition. They remain in business, not only just struggling, but they actually were making profits and they were increasing sales. So the question is, what makes these firms different than the rest? What are different value propositions, competing strategies? And stay tuned for a follow-up webinar on that particular topic, because that would piece together all of the numbers, how to use them, what does that mean in terms of where should I invest my advertising sales, which media will give me the highest returns, and what type of selling proposition is best for me depending on where I am in that spectrum that I talk about in terms of sales. So it's about putting at use all of these numbers. Unfortunately, I think that Charlie and I have done enough webinars to know that you want to keep them about 38 minutes of the actual presentation and before you open it up for question, or you lose the attention of people. So we couldn't really dig deep into the actual implications, but that is something that we probably will be talking about in more detail in some of the presentations that we do in person, and certainly in a follow-up seminar webinar in the near future.
Right, and in fact, whenever we release the full economic impact report, we'll schedule another webinar and go a little deeper on that report, because I know that there's a lot of association staff across the country and growers and service providers and retailers that are very interested in those numbers to use them as we were just talking about. Now, while you were answering that question, I stole the screen back from you, and I opened up a PowerPoint that I was using at Cultivate just this past weekend, and there's a little slide using these data of U.S. green industry establishments, and you can see the effect of the recession in terms of the total number of establishments in the industry. But not all that was felt equally among sectors, and obviously there were a larger number of some of the mow blow and go and half truck wheel landscape, the smaller landscape firms, as well as a number of those growing operations in the less than 250,000 category that you were talking about earlier. Albeit we did have some very sizable firms exit the industry, but that was more of a case of being over leveraged rather than a lack of an ability to produce quality plants, because we had some very reputable firms and friends and peers that we love dearly that exited, because sometimes the bank had more skin in the game than they did. So we still have a few of those issues remaining, and so we'll see a little more shakeout. But again, I don't want to take too much time today to discuss that, because we'll come back to that in a future webinar. So one last question on the ETA of the release of the economic impact report. And if I was a betting man, I would say it'd be around the end of August. Uh, wouldn't you agree, Marco? Given the pace at which we're moving, and it's in terms of the actual publishing of the report, it may be before then, but I want to underpromise and overdeliver here.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think that it will certainly depend on how long it takes for the actual processing. I think from our end, we'll probably be ready by then. Um, and I want to say that lately they have been very, very fast, and so I don't anticipate that that would be something that will delay the publication. So hopefully by sometime in September would probably be out.
Exactly. You know what? I'm just looking back through the questions and so forth, and I think we've got those addressed, and we're just about right on time. So, Marco, again, marvelous job. You were able to dissect these numbers. Let me just take a second to remind people that the webinar will be recorded, or it has been recorded, and it will be posted, and it'll be on the Ellison Chair website. You can see the address right here, ellisonchair.tamu.edu, multimedia webinars. Basically, there's a multimedia button over here on the right, and you can click on it, click on webinars, and you'll see the new listing by this time tomorrow. So be sure to check that out and share that with others you think might benefit from that. The only other remaining thing is just to remind you to very quickly fill out the evaluation. If there's any other questions, Marco gave you his email address, and I think most of you have my email address, c-hall@tamu.edu. Feel free to pop us an email and ask us any other questions, and just be on the lookout for news regarding our upcoming webinar regarding economic impact. So, Marco, thanks again. Very good job. Thank you for attending today, folks, and we'll look forward to talking to you next time. See you later.